grace this evening. Thank you very much. Lord God, we celebrate your goodness and give thanks for your care, for the food that we eat and for those that have prepared it, for the land that has grown it and for those that have farmed it. For this country and this county is ours, full of bounty and beauty. For all of these gifts we give our thanks. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Here's John. Right, good evening everybody, and welcome to Fenland SOIL Conference Dinner. Fantastic turnout this evening, following what was the most brilliant day today. I want to take the opportunity of thanking everybody for coming, but particularly for all the speakers and the people who chaired the sessions. We had a really interesting, enjoyable day, so thank you. So now we've got a keynote speech from Henry Dimbleby, who I've known for a number of years, and I've got the job of introducing him, which is quite a challenge, so I'm actually going to read this out, so it's a bit easier. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Henry to you all. Henry is an influential food systems innovator, and he's co-founder of the acclaimed restaurant chain Leon. He has dedicated his career to transforming the way we think about food. His work focuses on creating sustainable food systems that benefit both people and the planet. Henry studied physics and philosophy at Oxford University, from where his diverse educational background laid the groundwork for a multifaceted career in food and business. Before venturing into the food industry, he worked as a journalist with the Daily Telegraph and as a management consultant at Bain & Company. In 2004, Henry co-founded Leon, the fast food restaurant chain with a revolutionary approach. Leon quickly gained popularity for its delicious and healthy offerings, and under his leadership, Leon expanded significantly, promoting a new standard for fast food that prioritised both nutrition and sustainability. Henry's passion for improving food systems led him to co-author the School Food Plan in 2014, which aimed to transform food education and meals in UK schools. And in 2015, he received an MBE award for his work on improving school food. From 2018, he served as the lead non-exec director at DEFRA and was appointed to lead the development of the National Food Strategy. The strategy provides a comprehensive analysis of the UK food system and proposes actionable recommendations to improve health outcomes, support sustainable agriculture, and reduce environmental impact. Henry's writing and public speaking engagements continue to inspire positive change in food systems worldwide. Welcome, please welcome Henry Dimbleby. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. John has been an unbelievable support through all of the work of the National Food Strategy. He was on my advisory panel. I've visited his farms in Senegal last year. I visited his farm here, which was actually a slightly terrifying experience. I don't know if anyone here has been driven by Charles on his farm, but I wasn't sure I was going to make it at one point. We went about 70 miles an hour as far as I could make it down these tracks, and he wasn't even wearing a seatbelt. But we did make it, and John, thank you so much for all of your help. It's fantastic to be here today. What you're trying to do here is so important, this intersection of how on earth do we feed the country, how do we protect the environment, how do we not only reduce the impact of the food system on climate change, but also protect the food system from climate change, And really, I wasn't able to be here today, but just reading the agenda and seeing you get to grips in a real place, in one context, is fascinating. It's such important work. I was at Kew a couple of weeks ago being shown around by their head of trees, and there was a very similar story that they were trying to navigate. So they had, in the heatwave of 2022, they had lost 400 trees, oaks in particular. You have, I didn't know this before 2 Saturdays ago, but there are trees that are drought resistant, which means they hold in water, and there are trees that are drought avoidant, which most oaks are, which means they dig roots right down to find water. And those trees that are drought avoidant, their stoma on the underside of the leaves, they don't close tightly enough to hold in the vapour if it gets too hot. So the vapour, basically you get a difference in vapour pressure. The vapour starts to come out, and then what happens is that if the roots are in dry soil, air bubbles get into the capillaries that cannot be got out, and the tree dies. And he said you could tell a tree's died long before it actually dies. You can tell if it's got a bubble in. And so what he is doing, Kevin, is he is looking, measuring in some detail what the climatic conditions at Kew are likely to be like in 100 years' time, because when these trees die, he has to replace them. And so at the moment, the oaks that they're replacing the trees with in Kew, they've found on the Iranian-Azerbaijani border, because those oaks, interestingly, not only are able to cope with extreme heat, but he says that if the Gulf Stream stops and we start having extreme cold, they can cope with that too. So he has a map of all of his trees. You should go there, it's fascinating. And plant by plant, they're trying to work out what they need to replace for climate change. So that is another example of what you're doing here, which is how are we going to resist, how are we going to protect ourselves from climate change, how are we going to respond to it. And I thought it would be useful, and that was, in some ways, the National Food Strategy was about a similar thing on a national basis. I was asked at a time when the government had come in, we'd had Brexit, Michael Gove in DEFRA had set out to try and shift the EU Common Agricultural Policy to something that supported more biodiversity, carbon-friendly ways of farming. And there had been a huge furore, people were saying you can't eat butterflies, we're going to run out of food, what about health? And I was brought in to look at how can you at a national level create a food system that not only provides enough nutritious calories and does so in a way that is secure against climate change, but also sequesters carbon, restores biodiversity and makes people sick, not ill. And what I thought would be useful to talk about today would be to look forward. We're now at a really fascinating time in this administration where they're about to announce a whole raft of new policies on the food system. And it might be useful in this one to look forward to what might happen over the coming years when that happens. Before I do that, it's probably worth reflecting just very briefly on where we came out. And apologies to those of you who've heard that before, but basically, we started, I realised, by the way, that there's, because I'd done the school food plan, I'd done the work on school food, I realised that what we needed to do was not just have a raft of policies, you needed to create a narrative, and that was as important as the policies, because you never know which government's going to take up your recommendations, and when they do, you need to give them a narrative that they can use that explains why the system has gone so wrong. And the narrative we used, we talked about the food system as being a miracle and a disaster. A miracle because in 1945, we had no idea how we were going to feed almost double the population on the planet from the same amount of land that currently fed just under 4 billion people. And all of you pretty much in this room will know about the Green Revolution, which now feeds twice the number of calories to 8 billion people than it did after the Second World War, just under 4 billion people, from slightly less land. It's one of the great feats of human ingenuity that we did this by breeding new crops, by feeding them with Haber-Bosch fertilizer and new methods of irrigation. But the disaster was, which Norman Borlaug and those involved in the revolution couldn't possibly know, was that it turns out that in doing that, we created this just unbelievably destructive system, a system that destroys, it's the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse by far, it's the biggest cause of avoidable ill health now, much more than smoking, and it is the second biggest cause of climate change. 20 to 30% of greenhouse gases are emitted by the food system, but actually that's going to get worse. I hear often farmers saying, well, hold on, we're only, agriculture in the UK is only 12%. By 2035, 2040, the rest of the economy is decarbonising. Agriculture is going to be near 50% of our emissions. So this is only going to get more apparent. So that was the problem. What was the cause? We kind of looked back at the system dynamics thinking and tried to identify the feedback loops that were going wrong. And the good news in the food system is that there are two feedback loops that are very clearly identifiable. One is what we call the junk food cycle, the fact that we have an ancient appetite that evolved when calories were scarce, and certain kinds of food, if they resemble a lot of ultra-processed foods today, so if they're calorie dense, if they have certain ratios of salt to sugar to fat, they give us huge rewards for seeking them out, and they fill us up less quickly. And basically food companies have noticed that. They make more and more of this stuff, they put more and more money marketing it. Our evolved appetite goes, yippee, that's delicious. We eat more and more, they market more, they spend more money, and we get fat and sick. And we are now, in this country, 85% of the processed food sold by those companies is deemed too unhealthy to market to children. It's just, 57% of the food we eat is ultra-processed. It's completely taken over the food system. And the good news is, in a way, that the harm is so bad on the diet side that Treasury has noticed. So I was called in by Jeremy Hunt into Treasury when that figure that some of you will remember, the 2.8 million people who are out of work permanently, the highest number ever, came out. Treasury had noticed that diet was one of the major causes of these things. And they were trying to make the argument to the Office of Budget Protection that investing in improving people's diet was an investment, not an annual cost. So the good news is that the problem is now very visible. On the environmental side, there was another feedback loop that was going wrong. Partha Dasgupta called it the invisibility of nature. So what he said is that nature is not only literally invisible, so it's often underwater, it's in the sky, it's underground, it doesn't sit about waiting to be measured, it flies, it doesn't care about borders or anything like that. But he also pointed out that we don't even try and measure it in the ways that we measure human success. So you can't count nature in your wallet, it's not on the balance sheet of companies, although it is going to be soon. And it isn't in the way in which we measure GDP. And Dasgupta goes, well, it's not surprising that we're destroying it at such a great rate, because we're giving it away for free. In his Economics of Biodiversity, which is 600 pages long, and he refused to do a summary. The civil servant was like, you've got to do a summary, no one is going to read 600 pages. He's like, no, this is the answer, 600 pages. And in the end, they twisted his arm, he did a summary. And it's not actually, it's not very interesting, the summary, you have to read the 600 pages. So, and there's like 2 pages of mathematics where he works out if we continue to destroy nature at the rate we are, and GDP continues to increase at the rate it is, when we will go extinct, mathematically. So this is, when we say it's not sustainable, that's what he means. It cannot go on. It either changes or we'll go extinct. And Dasgupta points out it's even worse though. It's not just that we're giving nature away for free. He estimates that every year we're giving billions of dollars of subsidies to pay for the destruction of nature, to fossil fuel companies, to industrial fishing, to some forms of industrial farming. So we shouldn't be surprised. Now the good news is that if you're paying people to destroy something, it should be possible to reverse that. And so the recommendations that we made on the nature side of the equation were that you should continue to maintain the budget on the environmental land management scheme, that you should create a land use framework So we have this precious land, we have this soil here in Devon near me. We have, for some bizarre reason, we seem to grow a lot of corn for biodigesters on very bad land in Devon. And you see when it rains near me in Devon, you see the whole, I live near Dartmouth, and I went for a walk in particularly bad rains the other day, looking down over the estuary as the dark came out, and there was a semicircle about 3 kilometres in diameter of red water coming out, just the soil just flooding out into the channel from these maize for biodigester crops. So the land use framework is an effort to try and say, we have to get a grip of our resources. We have to understand what land we have and how we want to use it as a nation. It's not a Stalinist 5-year plan. It's about saying, if we're going to regulate, if we're going to pay farmers to do things, we need to be paying them to do sensible things, depending on where the soil is. And that was kind of, that piece of work, the land use framework, which is what you've been talking about today, was started under the Conservative government, and then has kind of been creeping along ever since. So where are we now, and what's going to happen over the next few years? Well, first of all, I would ask you to take pity on Steve Reed and Daniel Zeitner, who spoke this morning. I don't know, did anyone ask you about inheritance tax, or did you get out? So they fought tooth and nail to protect the 2.4 billion ELMS budget. And then they found out the day before the budget that Treasury were taking away, that were doing the inheritance tax thing. So they knew that there was this fragile coalition with farmers and NGOs that had been incredibly hard won, and that they needed to maintain that. And Steve Reed's I could never be a politician, because the idea of collective responsibility, to go out and defend something day after day that I suspect he doesn't really believe in, is a noble thing. So please don't boo him anymore like he was at the Oxford Farming Conference. So notwithstanding the fact that they have hit some turbulence in the inheritance tax, minor turbulence. By the way, on inheritance tax, I may well be wrong about this. I cannot see how they have 200 rural seats. I cannot see how they go into the next election without having found some fix. So I would be prepared to put a small amount of money on there being, at some point between now and the next election, there being an announcement that they found a way of focusing on the hedge fund money even more and protecting those farmers who are passing on land. I cannot see that the current position is possible, but we shall see. So what happens next? There are 2 major things to look out for. One is, and I know Tom talked briefly about this earlier on the day, one is the National Food Strategy. And the way in which that has been positioned and it's constituted, while it is positioned as an overall food security, the whole picture, the fact that it is set up with DEFRA, health and education gives a strong sense that there's going to be a lot about health in here. And the question is whether on that they can grasp the bullet. So there are two views here. One is that I've heard spoken by some people in the government, that we are trying to reform the NHS, and to try and reform the NHS at the same time as bringing in public health measures to make it less attractive, less commercially attractive to sell food to people that kills them. That's too much to take on. And then the other counter-argument to that is that you cannot make the NHS efficient enough to cope with the number of bodies that the food system is currently throwing at it. And that the economy, the growth mission, that is costing us £98 billion a year. And I think that is uncertain how that's going to play out. It all really comes down actually to Keir Starmer and where he wants to put his support. So I'm fascinated to see how that emerges. At the moment they've announced that there's going to be a kind of co-creation with industry, and we'll see. All to play for. I'm much more optimistic on the environmental side. And I wanted to end by talking about the land use framework. So, under the Tories, the work on the land use, when I was in DEFRA, and I haven't seen how the work's come on, but basically, whenever the kind of draft versions of the land use framework were surfaced, people would go, fucking hell, we can't say this publicly, because obviously it's about trade-offs, and there are, if you are honest about your land use framework, you're going to have to say the data tells us that we need this land for energy, we need this land for building houses, we need this land for food, we can't farm up to water courses because we're not going to meet our water purity targets. There are going to be trade-offs, and so any land use framework that starts is going to say we're going to have to move this much land out of production. That's going to require us to improve our productivity by X if we want to maintain our food production. What do we want to do about the fence? What is our view about the horticultural basket of the UK? You know, Therese Coffey, who was, I served under 5 Secretaries of State, one was Therese Coffey. She was talking at one point about we should just categorise peatland as grade 4 farmland, and we shouldn't let people farm it. You know, it's a view. So the land use framework, which is coming out on Friday, if they are bold, and whisperings are that they will be bold, will ruffle feathers, because these are difficult discussions to be had. What I hope they do is are bold, but then say, right, the next step, the consultation, happens at a local level, because what we need to do in Devon is very, very different from what you need to do here in the Fenlands, from what needs to happen in Cumbria. So if you talk, I spend a lot of time, I work with a Cumbrian business, and I spend a lot of time talking to Cumbrian farmers, and there it's all about how do you, at the same time as increasing the environmental outcomes, find ways of freeing up planning in the lakes to enable people to get other incomes, move tourists away from just Lake Windermere, get subsidiary incomes, allow people to build their farm buildings. There's a lot about planning. That will be different here, it will be different from Devon. So I hope that those conversations really get down to a local level, and then we come back up again and the government will have to announce what its response is. And what I would say to you, and I know that these are enlightened ears, if this is what you are doing here today, you don't need to be doing this. There are farmers who aren't engaging in this, and there are academics who aren't engaging with farmers, so this is a really important forum. And I would just urge you to try and engage, show leadership in your communities. If it does look tough, I've got no idea what it's going to say we need to have this conversation, but we cannot get into a Trumpian culture war about it. We have to have the inheritance tax conversation separately, but as a nation and as experts from every part of the food system, have that conversation in our communities. Because if we don't do it, we won't be able to produce enough food. The climate will get worse, biodiversity will get worse, and it will literally be unsustainable. At some point, it will break. So thank you very much for having me here today. I am so pleased that these kind of discussions are happening across the country, and please do show, on Friday, show some compassion for Steve Reed, but also please do engage in a positive way in the national conversation. Thank you very much.